introduction of our panelists. Then I have a few questions to get things started. And so we'll talk a little bit. Please use the chat to ask your questions, and then at about 7:40, we'll go to the audience for Q&A. And if you'd like to use the raise the hand function, you can also ask your question in real time. So I'll start with introductions with my first panelist, and that is Soljane Martinez. Soljane is the education coordinator at the Annenberg Institute. And Soljane's background is as a reporter and journalist for the Providence Journal and Wall Street Journal. And she was also a teacher and education background for grades 3rd through 12th grade. And Soljane earned her EDD from Johnson and Wales University. Next is Susanna Loeb, and Susanna is a professor of education and international and public affairs, and also the director of the Annenberg Institute. Susanna is a member of the National Board of Education Sciences, a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy and Research, faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and Susanna earned her PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. And the third panelist is Matt Kraft. Matt is an associate professor of education and economics at Brown. His background is teaching 8th grade English and 9th grade humanities, and Matt earned his PhD in quantitative policy analysis and education from Harvard University. So thank you so much, panelists, for being here this evening as well. So the title of our panel this evening is, again, Tutoring as an Equity Policy Intervention. So I thought I'd start off by just asking, how did you get interested in tutoring as an educational reform / intervention, and what work are you doing around it right now? And I'll start with Soljane, if you'd like to start talking about your interest in tutoring and what work you're doing around it right now.
Sure. Well, obviously, education background, tutoring and that one-on-one and small group work has always been part of that. But my interest really here at Brown was grounded in my role as the education coordinator at the Annenberg Institute. So that means that I coordinate Brown's K-12 programs with the needs of local schools, students, educators, and families. And as soon as COVID, really forced us to retreat, a few months ago, 9 months now, the Brown community and those who were already engaged in schools immediately asked, how can we continue to engage in schools, and continue serving our students and teachers? And tutoring was really that first go-to option. So over the last 9 months, there have been many more departments and people asking how they can get involved, how they can support our local schools. And it's really been a wonderful experience to be able to make those connections between folks in local schools based on my experiences and my networks in education, especially at the local level. And the most current initiative that we're very proud to share is Brown's Online Tutoring Initiative, which is a partnership between the Annenberg Institute, the Suarez Center, and Tutor Matching Services, which is a company that has built a platform through which we, Brown, can offer free tutoring to our local students.
Terrific, thank you. Susanna, what got you interested in tutoring as a policy intervention, and what are you currently working on?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. So again, once COVID hit and we were trying to think, okay, what do we know about different approaches and how they might be helpful to students and during the pandemic. And one of the things, of course, that happens in the pandemic is that we have this whole range of experiences, as we always do, but it's even more broad during the pandemic. And so each student is in a very different place. And so we wanted something that could really reach students where they were, and we needed something that focused not only on the academics, which may be one of the outcomes that we wanted to reach, but it's really about engaging students, making sure they have an adult they can turn to. And once we started thinking in that way, I think a number of researchers, I'm part of this group of researchers that met to think about these different approaches that could be used. Tutoring really came to the top, not only because it fits those bills, but of so many things that are studied. Tutoring is one that has consistently high impacts on student learning. And this isn't all kinds of tutoring. It's really this high dosage tutoring where students are with a tutor for, 50 hours over the course of at least 6 to 8 weeks, something like that. And so this tutor and student really develop a relationship, can really work on the things that students have trouble with. So that's how I got interested in it. And then I was talking with actually a member of our board in Annenberg, and he said he'd been part of a working group that was much more around practitioners and policymakers and funders thinking about tutoring as well. And so we joined forces, and then over particularly the last 3 months, what we've been trying to do is to think about, well, we had all this kind of amazing research on tutoring, and yet it didn't scale. Why was that? And so we've been trying to think about why didn't it work, and to scale naturally, and whether this is a good time or there are things that we could do that could help it scale. And that's really what we've been working on. And our sense is that one of the things that was missing was really defining what high quality tutoring was, and having a shared understanding of standards for tutoring. And so we're trying to do that, to make the evidence really clear, to build tools, and to create this kind of community of practice. But the other part that's difficult is for schools to implement this, because you need funding. It's not inexpensive, it's just cost efficient. It's a cost effective but costly. And so you really have to be willing to take the step to implement it, fit it in with your schedules. But the thing about COVID is it may actually have opened a window as schools are trying to figure out ways of doing it. And so what we're trying to think of there are ways to help schools and districts, if they're interested, implement it as well. So that's what we've been working on over the last few months, is thinking about whether there is the need for some source to kind of make it easier to get the tutoring that parents really want and schools can implement to be done at scale.
Thank you. Matt?
So I think my interest stems from all the way back in college. When I was an undergraduate, I worked as a tutor, and that was working with a middle school student who I actually got to work with for multiple years over time. And that was both from my own experience, one of the most kind of enriching and rewarding opportunities to kind of both provide service in a way and to be paid to earn money in college. And at the same time, I could see that the larger program that I was a part of was really impacting the lives of the students who were participating. And so that helped me to kind of, from a personal standpoint, see that potential. And several years later, when I was in graduate school at Harvard, I had the opportunity to connect with Match Charter School and one of its founders, Michael Goldstein, where kind of one of the core original models that a lot of the high dosage tutoring models that have developed emanates from. And I got to see firsthand how that worked, how this innovative charter school was using tutoring in a way that really wasn't happening anywhere else, integrating tutoring as a standalone, dedicated class into an extended day with full-time tutors staffed by AmeriCorps members, and with just rigorous ongoing observation and feedback and communities of practice within the tutor core itself. And that ended up being something I studied for one of my dissertation chapters, and was one of my first publications as an academic. And so it's always been of interest, but it all of a sudden, for all the reasons we've talked about now, seems to be particularly a moment in time when we really need to accelerate our understanding of how to make tutoring effective at scale. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing these days is thinking about the costs of tutoring, the cost side, because it may very well be that the most cost-effective model is not necessarily the most effective writ large. It could be that, well, we can actually do a pretty good job at supporting students and developing relationships between tutors and tutees if it's a 2-to-1 ratio of students to tutors or 3-to-1. And so there's a lot of open questions that we really need to figure out. And that's exactly what, under Susanna's leadership, the Annenberg Institute is building a network to do. And I also have been kind of involved in a passion project, which is just conducting a thought experiment about not what if we use tutoring to help support students in the immediate and important challenge of addressing COVID learning loss, but what if we also thought about tutoring not as a supplemental, standalone, complementary remedial thing that we maybe offer, or a private market service that you can pay for, but as just a complementary supplement to core group classroom instruction in our public schools. And I think we have, as Susanna mentioned, this unique opportunity where how we have organized schedules, how we've defined personnel roles in schools has been all thrown up in the air because of COVID. And these longstanding norms about how schools operate have finally been kind of challenged, and we see the possibility. And so I'm working on kind of a thought experiment to say, well, what if we had tutoring as part of the regular school day at scale in US public schools?
Matt, a follow up to this, and then ask this to the rest of the panel as well. Is what do we know about tutoring? So Susanna mentioned we know that it has high impact. What does the literature say about tutoring? What do we know? What do we need to know? What don't we know?
These are key questions, and I think as a researcher, the knee-jerk answer is we always need more research. But the truth is, we actually have a really rich research base on tutoring relative to a lot of other interventions out there in education. That doesn't mean we know everything we need to know. But some of the things that we know from recent meta-analyses that take causal evaluations of tutoring programs and examine their impact on primarily student achievement, but some other outcomes that are equally, if not more important as well, like persistence in school and social-emotional well-being. And we find that on average, tutoring programs of a wide variety of design features and tutor types produce impacts that are in the range of more effective than 80 to 90% of other educational interventions that we've studied out there. When you look at the kind of full distribution of types of rigorously evaluated education interventions. We also know that tutoring is costly. It's just hard to substantially minimize those costs when it's really about personnel. And then there's, I think, areas where we know a lot less about that have the potential to moderate those costs. For example, the use of technology via virtual tutoring to minimize commute costs, the use of potential more near peer or cross-age peer tutoring, of leveraging kind of high school students, for example, as elective courses to provide tutoring. Those are areas where we need to know a lot more. And critically, for the moment we're living in, we need to know about how to maintain efficacy, or at least how to preserve good, even if it's not great, tutoring at scale. Because the thing that I think we need to remember is that the impacts we're finding on this body of literature, which is largely smaller to medium-sized studies that are happening in ideal circumstances or in kind of privileged contexts of, you know, the researchers are committed and these are people that are volunteering and eager to be part of the program, that it's going to be hard to maintain that at scale under much more diverse and heterogeneous context. But even if we achieved impacts that were half of that magnitude, that's still a very substantive benefit. And there's a whole host of other potential benefits, which we need to learn more about: effects on social emotional outcomes, effects on kind of persistence in school, potential benefits from the tutor side about their contributions, even potential benefits of creating a new pipeline of local community members who might eventually see education as their career choice because they've been exposed to that opportunity.
Thanks, Matt. Susanna, same question, but I'm curious if we know more about along like age groups or demographics, or does tutoring have an impact on along subject lines? What does the literature and research look like from your perspective? I think Susanna is frozen. So Sol Jane, what is your perspective on what we know, what we don't know, what we need to know?
So it's interesting. I always defer the research piece to Matt and Susanna. You know, they're the research gurus. I look at this more through the lens of the community, right, and the education, the students and teachers. But, you know, I will tell you what history tells us is that if you think about it, tutoring was really the first educational system, right? You go back to the great philosophers and scholars who taught, but also deeply connected with their students. And they did that one-on-one or in small groups. And that right there is tutoring. And, you know, Matt's story of his experience in college really resonated because someone actually reached out to me about this event, and they shared how much of a positive impact tutoring had on them as early as second grade, and again multiple times, right, as they, you know, grew older and throughout their academic life, so much that they eventually became a tutor because, you know, in their words, they wanted to re-gift that to other students. And even now as an adult, you know, this person has, you know, lived many experiences, and they still credit tutoring for their confidence as a student and their ability to be able to overcome some of educational obstacles. You know, and I'll also share about the multiple emails that I've received from parents, many of whom, you know, felt lost in this new world of virtual education and virtual everything. A lot of them felt unprepared to serve as, you know, what they called being a co-teacher to their child's teacher, in terms of all the additional support that virtual learning entails. So for parents, you know, they've expressed to me that to know that they can access this kind of cadre of folks who are stepping forward to specifically help their child is helpful, and it's something that you know, they've expressed over and over, feeling a sense of relief to know that programs like these are out there. I guess in terms of needing to know, what I would like people to know is that tutoring is so much more than schoolwork and the academic piece. And, you know, for us, a big piece of the tutoring are the relationships that we hope that our tutors will build with students, right? Whether it's a third grader or a high school junior, we really are hoping that, you know, our local students begin to see themselves, and they can see themselves in our tutors, or even see themselves at college, whether that's Brown or not. We really are hoping that our local students will be able to connect with these younger, you know, people that are a little bit closer to their age than probably most of the adults that, you know, they interact with on a daily basis, but to really connect on that personal level and get mentorship out of it as well. And that's really a big focus of our platform, and a big desire for the tutors that currently serve on the Brown online platform. And, you know, I think that the work that Annenberg is doing with the National Student Support Accelerator and many of the other projects and research, you know, happening at Annenberg is helping us answer these questions. What do we know and what do we not know more and more every day?
Thank you for that. I like the emphasis around the mentorship and the socio-emotional part of things. Susanna.
Yes, sorry about that. And sorry, everybody, because I just don't have the most stable internet. So I may go in and out. I will try my best not to. So I just, in reiterating in some ways what Sol Jane was saying, I think one of the things that was striking during the pandemic is how parents that had a lot of resources, that had high income and means, bought a lot more tutoring for their students, for their children, but that's not available to everybody. And what is really, I think, important is that we can see during the pandemic how much inequality that creates in the access that students have to high quality education. And I think it's actually true. We just didn't see it as clearly prior, where lots of parents were in high income areas were investing in tutoring and others were where they couldn't, and where families that couldn't do that didn't have that option. And the reason that when families have the funds, they invest in it is because it's pretty clear that if a student only isn't doing something well in a class because they don't know this kind of one thing, this one part of how you work with fractions, or this one part about decoding when you're learning to read, having someone who can just recognize that and can help them in the moment is just so important for moving forward. So I do think like we have this evidence that parents would want this if we were able to provide it. And I think that's a really important part. In terms of what we know, I agree with Matt that we just know that tutoring can be effective, and it can be effective. It's actually most effective if you have a certified teacher in a really organized place, but it can also be really effective with para-educators, with a whole range of other kinds of people. And one of the good parts about it is that it could also be a way of diversifying the teaching force that is working with students and bringing in skills and experiences to a student's education that we don't get currently just in the teaching force. And so I think it could be kind of a pipeline for teachers, as well as a great source of other kinds of knowledge and skills. In terms of what I would like to see developed, it's actually tools that would help tutors and tutoring organizations provide things with quality without having to make them up again. So how do you create a safe environment? How do you make sure that the tutors are using culturally responsive kinds of pedagogy when they're working with the students? What kinds of assessments, just casual assessments, can tutors do of their students so that the tutors are really providing the students what they need? So I think we know tutoring can be effective, and now it's a question of how can we make it effective for all these different places, because it's a really fragmented group of tutoring organizations right now, some of which have great mean really well and have great resources, great tutors to work with, but they change around a lot. And as a result, for example, in universities often, they may not be using kind of our latest knowledge of what good tutoring is. So to the extent that we could have research that could show us what kinds of things can help some of these less formal organizations do a better job in tutoring, I think that would be really useful.
On this point, Susanna, how could tutoring be scaled within schools or in districts? How can that be imagined? Did I lose Susanna?
No, I'm here.
There you are. How could that be imagined? What do you think it would take to do that, to scale things?
Yeah, so I think there are two different kinds of ways that we could scale. And one has to do with a big federal investment. So we're in a point right now where schools are struggling. They don't have the resources they need given all the challenges they face. I think it will be very hard to pull funds within schools from what they need to be doing to invest in something as big as tutoring right at this moment. So I think there has to be some other kind of investment. There's going to be investment going into schools. If we're going to really have good schools in the country, we're going to need more money in them. But if we could have some of that investment go into tutoring, at least in the short run, I think that would be a real plus. And it again is a plus, both because tutoring is so effective when students have had these wide experiences, it's even more effective. But in addition to that, it could provide employment and job skill training opportunities for many underemployed and unemployed people. There are a lot of students graduating from college right now, and the labor market is not very strong, yet they have all these skills and all this potential, and it could be really it could really help them. And again, it could really help provide a pipeline of people who can be teachers in the future and work with students in the future, which is very important for our country in general.
Soljin, what's your perspective on the scaling up?
Sure, and I'm speaking from my experience with our program. I would say to start small and start and focused. You know, I think if we start trying to offer tutoring for all content areas to everyone, it makes it really difficult to capture a picture of whether the tutoring is moving that needle in the right direction. So, for example, currently our platform is in a pilot phase with Hope High School, and our tutors are available to a cohort of 9th grade Algebra 1 students working with 5 teachers during their math lab classes. So our tutors are embedded within the school day during the math lab course, which means that, you know, whether the student is in school at home or face-to-face, they can access our tutors and their sessions during this particular class. In terms of possibilities and larger scale, I like to dream big. And, you know, I would ask, imagine the impact that institutions of higher ed in Rhode Island could really have on the system if all of our colleges and universities in the state could have or offer a program like this and really create this network of free tutors for the community. And I kind of think of, you know, the commercials for cell phones when they show their maps blinking with all their coverage. Imagine the power in universities kind of having this network or this coverage of communities, especially those that really need it, of tutoring for our local students. So that would be my big wish list when asked for possibilities.
Matt.
So I really agree with the ideas here that Soljan and Susanna have suggested around opportunities for scale. I think we have to be cautious in the moment of our enthusiasm for this potential to recognize that it is hard to scale anything in a system that's as diffuse and diverse as the way we deliver public education in the United States. That shouldn't prevent us from identifying it as having real potential, but so many prior attempts, even to scale tutoring, have hit upon rocky shores and particularly have fallen flat despite kind of excessive rhetoric about all the things that tutoring might ultimately accomplish. We can learn from past attempts, such as under President Clinton to scale America Reads. We can learn from past attempts, such as the use of supplementary educational services, such as tutoring funded under No Child Left Behind, which were largely separate from schools, provided after school. Both of those were big and bold visions, but lacked some of the things that we've talked about, some kind of core common design principles, some communities of practice around continuous improvement and learning, and in many cases, lacking the large-scale funding that's going to require to sustain this investment. I think that there are a couple specific avenues we could pursue, and that we should have a multifaceted approach because we're still learning what might work and be possible. I think the opportunity to leverage an expanded federal work-study program to fund college students to serve as tutors has a real potential. It's an infrastructure and a system that exists that could be built on and would require a lot more formal support and organization, but I think that's exactly what Annenberg is doing to innovate and support. We could also, as many other scholars have kind of suggested, scale AmeriCorps as a program and try to carve out a space for AmeriCorps volunteers to specifically work on tutoring. There are other school-based AmeriCorps programs like Cydia and others that do really important work, but that isn't exclusively focused on kind of high dosage tutoring. It's a lot of different models with a lot of wraparound supports. And I think, although we know less about it, there's a lot of schools out there that are innovating around kind of peer-to-peer tutoring in the same classroom, or offering as an elective in high school the opportunity to go to the local elementary school and work with younger kids around developing their reading skills. And so I think those particularly have the benefit of offering, opportunities to develop skills for both the older peer tutor and the younger student who might benefit from it. And so those seem like avenues that would be fruitful, but not guaranteed to be successful.
Matt, you've mentioned high dosage tutoring a couple times. What is the definition of the high dosage tutoring?
That's a great question. I think some of the characteristics of that are about dosage referring to you're getting frequent tutoring multiple times a week. For example, 3 to 4 to 5 times a week, maybe 30 minutes a day. So it's frequent, and it kind of stems from this model that came out of Match and other places, and organizations like Saga are implementing that. It's really centered on, I think, as Soljay mentioned, a core focus of supporting students' achievement. They have integrated approaches to not just being separate from the school, but coordinating curriculum with what teachers are doing, and a system that kind of rigorously both recruits, vets, and supports the tutors who work with the same students over an extended amount of time. Susanna, you've worked on defining these models. Would you add other things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly having a lot of it, which is what you were talking about, is important. And I think that embedding it in the school somehow seems to be really important, in part because then students know to be there. If there's a consistency to it that just makes it feel like something that is part of their day. And I think that's really a big part. Some of the programs that try to do it in other places, some students will show up, but sometimes it's not the students who could benefit the most from it that are showing up. And so by having it in school, you're really getting access to the students that way. The other thing that it's really kind of defining it from what it's not, but when many of us thought of tutoring in the past, we might have thought, well, what tutoring is I'm a student, I come to the tutor, I say, I can't figure this out, can you help me? That's not what this high dosage tutoring is. This high dosage tutoring is a much longer relationship that's developed, where you're really building on something over time and not really relying on the student to know what he or she doesn't know, but instead really learning that together and building that together. So that's what I think of as in terms of high dosage tutoring.
We're starting to get some questions and comments in the chat box. So the most recent one comes from Jordan, and Jordan asks about what experience or evidence do you have regarding the equity impact of tutoring programs beyond K through 12? Any evidence for adult or continuing education or prison education? Anyone have?
Matt?
I think we lack a lot of evidence for understanding the role of tutoring in broader settings. Although what I will say is that I think we shouldn't ignore the evidence that is there in the existence of the private market. There's a huge demand for private tutoring at all levels of education, including in college and beyond. And although we should be very concerned that that opportunity is not equitably accessible to all students, the fact that that is in the United States alone, tutoring in the private market is a $47 billion industry annually, suggests that there has to be positive benefits for folks to continue to come back and spend their hard-earned money.
Soljay, we're getting a number of comments about Providence and Brown, the Brown initiative around tutoring. how does that look right now in terms of the tutors that are in the schools? What are you starting to see starting to get any feedback from the tutors or from the students? How's the initiative started off?
Sure. So currently we have 15 active tutors on our platform. Most of them work specifically with our pilot program. However, it is open to other schools that have asked for access to the platform. The platform originally was public, but because we intentionally want our tutors to service our local students, we had to kind of hide our platform from the public and only share it with the schools and the families that were interested. We wanted to ensure that it was for our community. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? What
Yeah,
do we,
just what,
yeah?
yeah, what are you starting to hear back from either tutors or students or both?
So from students, I've heard back from several students that have had sessions at Hope. It's helpful. It's for them, I think, refreshing to have someone that they can relate to a little bit more, and that in their eyes seems to have a different take on, the material and the content. And I try to put myself back in high school, right? And when your math teacher delivers something, it's quite different than when someone who's, a few years older than you delivers it. You're a little bit more engaged and participating a little bit more actively. So we've gotten that from tutors. Something that we're working really hard on with our tutors is to ensure that they're really grounded in training and the framework that we expect them to use. So we work with the Tutoring Cycle by Ross McDonald, and we've had an educational consultant provide and create 4 professional development sessions for our tutors to ensure that they are grounded in that framework and that expectation. Also, part of our platform requires that our tutors complete the SWARE Center's community orientation, which covers, it's really deeply rooted in the local landscape. So part of that orientation, in order for them to earn these 3 badges and be able to actively tutor, means that they have to learn about the history of Providence through demographics and data, learn about their positionality, right, through power and privilege, and in terms of our communities, but also how to maintain, healthy boundaries and relationships. So, we wanted to make sure that we weren't just kind of throwing kids onto a platform and expecting them to be educators, because they're not. I always tell the tutors, your first priority here at Brown is to be a student. That is why you are here. So we can't really expect to add this huge burden of also expecting them to be teachers to other students. So our big push is to ensure that our tutors are trained, that they're prepared in terms of content, but in terms of the community that they're serving, and looking at everything through an equity lens and a culturally responsive way. And that's really, one of our biggest goals is to ensure consistency with what our tutors know, ensure consistency with how they're engaging with the community. And ideally, we'd love to eventually have hundreds of Brown University tutors that can connect with local students.
A quick follow-up, someone is asking, what's the time commitment for a Brown student to
Sure.
tutor?
So the application is on a rolling basis. They can apply at any point throughout the year. And for tutors, we do ask that they can commit to at least 3 sessions a week. And a session is typically an hour, but that can vary 45 minutes to an hour.
There's a question from earlier around any free online courses to teach remedial reading, and this question comes from Lucy. Susanna, I'm curious what you found in your research, the difference maybe between in-person tutoring and remote tutoring, or getting tutoring from, for example, a free online class.
Yeah, that's a good question. So though I'm not totally sure I'm going to answer it, almost all of the current research on tutoring is not online. I think we're beginning to get some evidence that you can have similar effects online that you can in the kind of one-on-one tutoring online versus one-on-one tutoring in person. But most of the research that we've been talking about has been in person. Online classes are different because that's more like a class and you've got lots of kids in it. I think those are not nearly as effective, in part because the reason that makes tutoring good is because you've got this really good personal connection. My guess is that that's better in person, but we can have a personal connection when we're talking directly to each other when it's a really small group, but maybe not so much broadly. We are creating kind of a landscape, trying to pull in tools that are out there right now. And we have some that we've found, but we're not at the stage yet where we know exactly what's out there and how good they are. We're hoping to get there in a bit.
Thanks, thank you. Matt, a question from Amber about, she agrees that tutoring integrated in schools is the best practice, but also feels like adding to teachers' plates even more. How can programs be maximally supportive and aligned, but minimally burdensome?
This is a great question, and I think illustrates in some ways that there are some tensions inherent in scaling tutoring as part of the public school system. I mean, one could fairly ask, well, why spend that money on tutoring? Why not reduce class size or increase teacher salaries? And I think that would be a fair question to ask. And so these cause us to kind of grapple with trade-offs. In my view, and in the research literature and in just anecdotal conversations, I think there's often a healthy skepticism about who are these tutors, what is their role in this school. But to the extent that tutors can complement the work that teachers are doing, that I think teachers can see them as partners in their joint collective effort to support student success. But that may ask of teachers more coordination than is traditionally what we, as a norm in public schools, see across classrooms. Schools have kind of historically long been very insular, kind of egg crate, closed doors institution. And so I think if we're going to be realistic about the full potential here, we need to be honest about potentially increasing the length of the school day and compensating teachers for this work and providing time for it. Or we need to have infrastructure in the form of a dedicated school-based tutor program coordinator whose job it is to facilitate that communication in a organized and efficient way, rather than having 30 tutors emailing a teacher every day about what do I need, and my student struggled on this, and I forgot what the homework assignment was. And so I think it's about organizational practice and infrastructure. I think it's about changing norms in schools. And I think it's about, recognizing that asking more of teachers means that we need to consider ways in which we can compensate them for that.
And I would like to add that part of our program includes tutor site leaders to kind of avoid that, right? A teacher juggling 30 tutors now for 30 students. So we do have site leaders whose main responsibility is to communicate within a school with the teachers, exchange of materials, get feedback from the teacher, in terms of the program, how more can we support you? And kind of serving as that bridge between the university and the school. So we're starting small and we're learning as we go, but it's definitely, I think, a helpful aspect of the program.
Just a reminder to please keep asking your questions. These are fantastic questions, so please keep adding them to the chat as we go along. Susanna, I know that everyone on the Zoom is really concerned about equity, and so one of my questions was, how can we ensure that tutoring interventions promote equity rather than widen disparities?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. And I mean, one of the good things I think about the research that's out there is it is really research for students and about students who maybe are struggling the most. It's not that this is research done in test in schools or high income communities or anything like that. The results that we see are for students who are often many grade levels behind in their work. And so in that way, we know it can be an effective approach for students who are struggling the most. I do think that some of what we're talking about in terms of embedding it in schools, making sure we have the resources, that is in order to have it be more equitable. I really worry that if it's a volunteer-in program or parents need to figure out how to access it, you're going to add to the inequality instead of lessen it. And so that's one, I think, key feature. And the other is really to make sure that the tutors, just like Soljing was talking about, really understand the community and the kids and know how to reach the kids where they are and have an equity lens on it when they go in as well. So I think there are big structural things that we have to worry about, and then there's the kind of details of what the actual tutoring session is like that we really want to think about as well when we're designing these kinds of programs.
So Jane, what's your insight?
Sure. We know this country has struggled with an unjust and inequitable education system since it first began. And like Susanna said, even before COVID, most students in this country were already behind several grade levels. So kind of moving into this realm of virtual everything throws this huge monkey wrench into the picture. So, I think that part of our role as an institution of higher ed is to ensure that our community partnerships are two-way. And that doesn't always mean that both sides are giving equally, right? It means that just like in any relationship, whether it's, an athletic team or two best friends, one side often has to pick up the slack and carry the weight for the other. That's true partnership and collaboration. So I think especially in times like this, COVID, but then beyond, because, we know that there will be an after this, any tutoring program really has to be collaborative partner with schools, with communities, and we haven't even mentioned like local businesses who can help ensure equity. So I kind of think of what's happened across the country in many cities where you have local cable companies that are providing free Wi-Fi or internet, right, for families, and we hope that that would last beyond just the COVID, but that coupled with a district providing devices, then coupled with providing the tutoring, that's just one example of how we can start ensuring more equity.
Matt, what is your perspective in terms of thinking about how tutoring can promote equity rather than widen that disparity?
Yeah, I think part of a way to think about this is doing nothing means that we are continuing with the status quo, that tutoring is largely only accessible to families who can afford it in the private market. And so that, in my view, is a call to action. And so then we have to ask, well, how can we then deliver in a way that we think will allow it to be successful within the infrastructure of schools, so that we're not, similar to the question about adding a burden to the teacher's plate, and as Susanna signaled, adding burden to overworked parents' plate of having to coordinate this and arrange for it after school, and it's one more thing. And so the extent that we can formally integrate it into the norms of a public school system, and then do so in a way, if we're focused on addressing issues of equity, which I strongly believe we should be, that targets those schools first and foremost, that because it's likely that any effort to scale this is going to confront an initial limited supply of tutors, whether they be full-time recent college graduates, part-time college students, to staff these positions, that we try to facilitate those partnerships with local community members in those districts that most need these levels of support, in communities who've been most negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And do so in a way that isn't just about scaling with kind of attention to the superficial hallmarks of like the program is there, it exists. Like we have tutors and the opportunity for that to happen is there. We have to ask ourselves, have we supported it with the funds that are sustainable and necessary for it to thrive? And are we allowing it to be a program that has a system that doesn't get caught up in the red tape and the bureaucracy that school systems are inherent for, that can innovate and problem solve because there will be problems abounding? And are we going beyond just kind of there's the space and place for tutoring to asking, are we developing a norm and a culture in a school that this is equally as important as your other core classes? And this is a serious academic endeavor. And we expect everyone to be there. We treat it with that kind of importance. And so that when we implement tutoring, we do so in a way that makes a difference for those who most need it.
If we can stay on this for just a second, Jada asks, what makes peer tutoring most effective, specifically peer tutoring for students of color, since many times the majority white tutoring team does not feel accessible for a student of color? Do you have any
Yep.
thoughts or
Okay.
reaction?
Sure. Thank you, Jada, for that question. You know, diversity in our tutoring pool is something that I struggle with and push every day. I think it's important for students, especially our Black and Brown students, to see themselves in tutors and make that connection, which is why a big part of our, again, training for all tutors is that awareness of the communities that they're serving and where their place is, because honestly, many of you know, our students at Brown come from very different experiences and communities than the students that they're engaging with. So I think for me, first and foremost, is to have a very diverse pool of tutors that reflect the students that they're engaging with. And something that is part of our application process is we actually ask tutors for any biliteracy skills. So whether they're bilingual and they can communicate, and we've listed quite a list of the top languages spoken in the Providence Public School Department by families, and there's an option for other languages. And tutors that are proficient in multiple languages, we ask them that they identify themselves as so on their tutor profile, and also include their tutor profile in another language. So currently, most of our multilingual and biliterate tutors speak Spanish. So that's something that we ask them to put high up in their profile so that students and families that speak those languages are aware of that. And, you know, little by little, we hope to kind of break down those walls.
Just a quick follow-up on this, Soljane. Are the tutors from Brown, are they eligible to be compensated through the university, through what does that
Yeah.
look like?
So students that are eligible for work study can be compensated through that. Otherwise, it's voluntary. And we have a pretty good mix of tutors that are doing it, you know, on a volunteer basis, and those that can get paid. You know, add that to my wish list. If we could fund it and pay all of our tutors, I'll put that out there. If, you know, we can make that happen, that would be my biggest desire for our tutors, because they work their butts off, and they do this with amazing intention and heart, and they love doing it, and we would love to be able to compensate them all. But like Matt and Susanna say, it's not cheap.
Carrie, can I just add one thing to what Soljane was saying? I think this is a really important question, and we don't have good evidence about within tutoring that having a same race tutor or having someone from your own community is particularly useful, but we can just assume that it is, given that there's so much evidence in the teacher workforce that it is. And what is in some ways nice about tutoring is that you've got an opportunity there. That doesn't mean that you can only draw on this relatively limited workforce that already has certification and has chosen to go into tutoring. So in our larger project, we're working with a number of historically Black colleges and universities to try to hook them up as tutors. When in general, when you look at paraeducators in the system. They're much more representative of the student population than teachers or administrators in the system. So I do think it's got a good potential for having the kinds of role models and teachers for students, kind of tutors for students that can have some of these experiences and skills.
Thank you. In these last few minutes, there's a question from earlier from Shiv, and Shiv asked about the challenges of work study programs or near peer tutoring by college students, and the challenge can be that limited training or limited time for professional development. So, how can one determine what training is essential in a pretty limited amount of time? Any takers on that one?
So part of our platform, there's a required initial module that our tutors have to complete, which is an online tutoring essential course. It's about a 3 to 5 hour course, depending on the participant, which again sets that foundation for how to engage virtually, tutoring, online. And, like I've said previous, we require that all tutors do take that community orientation training, as well as the 4 additional trainings that we've developed based on the tutor cycle that we're using. So what I know from other institutions is there really isn't training like that. They'll just, accept tutors, put them on a platform and, go ahead and have fun. Another piece of it is that, the administrators of this platform, myself and another colleague at the Source Center, we also have the ability to drop into these tutoring sessions. So, having been a school principal, I akin it to a classroom walkthrough. I can pop in on a session and simply observe and then be able to provide, that tutor with some feedback later on areas of strengths and for me to find patterns and see where our tutors might need more support.
Thank you.
Can I also give a super nerdy researcher answer to that question?
Please.
So I think that tutoring has so much great evidence because it's really easy to kind of randomly assign or to be systematic in how you assign tutors so that you get to learn. And I think that's where we are right now. As we scale up tutoring, it's going to be really important to say, I don't know if this kind of training is useful, but let's give it to half of them and not to the other half. And then let's do these drop-ins that Sol-Jane was talking about and see if we really see a difference in the kinds of interactions, or if we really see a difference in how much the students are learning. And we've got this great opportunity, I think, in tutoring, and it's been much easier in tutoring. You can't change the finance system of schools and vary it in different ways. That's just not a fair thing. But this is one that we really don't know whether this kind of training is more important than that kind of training. Let's try both of them and just see which one works better.
I'm sorry, Matt, did you want to?
Just very briefly, I'll close with the idea that I think very similar to the evidence we have for teachers. I think the conversations that I've had with a lot of leaders in the field of tutoring services suggest that tutoring is about experience and on-the-job development and training. And as Sol-Jane mentioned, the opportunity to get immediate and ongoing feedback. And so the extent that as AmeriCorps models use, as Sol-Jane has mentioned, you can take a cohort of tutors and then after that year, leverage the experience of some of them to serve as peer leaders to lead communities of practice around improvement. And so I think it's an opportunity to bake in both kind of leadership opportunities and continuous improvement opportunities into a tutoring model.
Well, thank you for that, Matt. Thank you, Sol-Jane. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you to our audience as well. This has been recorded and will be up on the Education Department's website in just a couple days. So thanks again. And please check us out. We'll be doing more of these through the spring semester.